Hey you, yeah you're here. Welcome to graduate school. Or maybe you're just checking out a new course, or maybe you're an undergrad and you're super smart, so you're with all these other grad students. But anyway, here you are. You are freshly minted out of wherever you came from before. Maybe you studied psychology, maybe you studied something else, but you are ready to start something new. You are ready to embark on a new adventure, to study and write about maybe the human brain. It's quite an amazing thing. Actually, you have a very particular interest. You want to study cognitive psychology, and you've come to Stanford to join the lab of Russ Poldrack. Well, who's Russ Poldrack? Well, I'll leave you to Wikipedia searching to read more, but Russ is a cognitive psychologist that does a lot of study about how we make decisions. And so, how does he do that? Well, he uses this thing called MRI, which means magnetic resonance imaging. So, just to give you a quick overview, there's actually two kinds of pictures of your brain that you can take. There's one called an anatomical image, which you can think of like a static snapshot. If your brain went to get its picture taken at school picture day, and it was just one really detailed, nice shot to show where everything is, that would be the anatomical. Now, the other kind is called functional, or referred to as fMRI. And this is kind of the cooler part because this is like a movie of your brain over time. It's actually picking up brain activity, and it does this by way of something called the BOLD signal, which means blood oxygen level dependent. I won't go into the details, but basically when you think of, for example, cats, let's say that there's a cat part of your brain, blood will rush to that area, and as it basically flows away, what we take a picture of is this deoxyhemoglobin. So, and then what we can do is we can basically look at these pictures over time from a functional scan, and this basically tells us what neurons are firing and to what degree. So, here we are. We have our PI, we have our lab. Let's say that we are very interested in decision making. So, for example, Russ is going to basically study the brain by taking pictures of it while people are doing different kinds of tasks where they are making important decisions. So, what's the most important decision that I can think of right now? Maybe the decision to choose a good snack. Maybe you're really interested in what happens when you choose cookies or something else versus some kind of control condition. So he brings this problem to you, and he says, "Hello, my young Padawan. Today I want you to design this study, and it's up to you to come up with a design. So let's do this. Let's right now, not kidding, design our first study using fMRI." So let's first step back. Before you design anything, you really need to come up with a question that you're asking. Why are you doing the study in the first place? So what we're really interested in is if there's some difference between making choices between different kinds of snacks and then some control. So what's a control? Let's see. I guess a control for a snack would be like making a decision between maybe shapes. So maybe in your experiment condition, you're going to be choosing between cookies and, I don't know, candy? No, cookies and cakes. I like cookies and cakes. And then in your control condition, you're going to be choosing between squares and triangles and circles or what have you. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to recruit subjects to participate. We're going to put them in the MRI scanner. First, we're going to take an anatomical shot. And again, the anatomical is so that we can register the functional data to it and know where everything is. And then we're going to basically show them pictures of cookies and cakes, have them make a decision. Then we're going to show them pictures of squares and circles, also have them make a decision, and have them being recorded the entire time. And it's going to be done in what's called a block design. Kind of looks like this, where the idea is that you have blocks of cookies and cakes and then blocks of shapes. I won't go into the details of this, but when you set up the design for your analysis, this block design will be important so that works okay. you need to first understand what we already know about the human brain and decision making before you come up with your hypothesis. For example, you may decide that there is no significant difference between decision-making centers when you're choosing between cookies and cakes versus a control, or, and this is the one that I would believe, there is some kind of difference between decision-making when you're choosing cookies and cakes and a control, perhaps in some area of the brain that is associated with reward. Because it's super, super rewarding to choose a cake or a cookie, but it's like not super exciting to choose a shape because it's just a shape. So this is the information that we need. We need this background, this research. So if I told you to do this right now, what would you do? Well, I can tell you what I would do. I would go to Google and I would do, hey Google, let me do a search for brain and decision making. Yeah, it looks good. Then I'd get a bunch of results and I'd have to filter the results and figure out what to read. And how do I know what's good? This is the internet. It's like anything can be written on here. I have no idea. I could also, well, maybe I'm sitting in my office in my brand new it's probably not a new psychology building. Let's be realistic here. I could just walk around and ask people, hey, what do you know about decision making in brain centers and anything? Or I could say, I'm going right to the journals. I'm going to go to the library and read up on my literature. But let's be real. I don't think many people go to the library anymore these days. Everything's on the internet. In case you didn't know. So geez, all these, they kind of seem really hard. I guess to start, we can try searching Google. It seems like a good idea. So let's do that. Searching Google. Now we kind of hit another problem. There's all these other terms, decision making, decision science, reward propagation. No, I'm just kidding. I made that one up. We basically get all these different terms that we think might be kind of related to decision making, and we're not really sure where to cut the line. Is decision making the same as reward? How is it, decision analysis? Is it something else? I don't know. So then at this point, you just feel lost in the wilderness of psychology terms. And matter of fact, you're even farther away from your literature review than when you started. Well, never fear, my student, my Padawan, I will not abandon you, and actually, there are tools that are going to help you. Today we're going to talk about two of those tools. I know that was a very long intro. They are the Cognitive Atlas and Neurosynth. Okay, so here we are, we're streaming around the internet, and we come across the Cognitive Atlas. Notice that this is at cognitiveatlas.org, and this is the Poldrack Lab's Cognitive Atlas that we were talking about. And so let's remind ourselves why we're here. Well, we had gone to Google and we did a search for, what is decision making, and we got all these results and we were just totally overwhelmed. So we need this place. And so what is the Cognitive Atlas? It's this community developed knowledge base for concepts in cognitive psychology. More formally, this is this thing that's called an ontology, but less formally, you can think of it as this place where you can look up what a term means that you see in the psychology literature, like decision making or abstract knowledge or backward masking that you have no idea what it means, and understand how it relates to other terms. And so more formally, we have these ideas or sort of concepts or tests or phenotypes, and we want to understand, for example, how different concepts, for example, how does activation relate to other concepts? So let's actually walk through this by way of our example. So we were really interested, we might be really interested in working memory. And so we go through here and we say, oh, here's auditory working memory. There's these different things that are called concepts and tasks. And I would say it's sort of a bug that this result should come up first, but we find our working memory. So here's working memory. We're going to click it. So note that this is a concept. And so a concept is sort of, if you notice the atlas is broken into these different kinds of things. A concept is something like working memory, like anxiety, versus a task might be like a behavioral paradigm that you do that measures some sort of one or more concepts. Okay, so let's go back to working memory, since I spent that time to find it. So very quickly, we can see some things that we might be looking for. So what are some use cases that we'd actually want to be here in the first place? Well, we may just literally stumble on a term, have no idea what it means, and then say, working memory is active maintenance and flexible updating of goal task relevant information in a form that resists interference but has limited capacity. And then, okay, that's pretty cool. And so that's really useful, but I'll note also that this hasn't been reviewed. One thing about the Cognitive Atlas that you can't see unless you log in is that it's actually a community sort of maintained resource. So the idea would be that different experts would all kind of look over this definition and say, oh, well, I disagree that it's flexible. In fact, it's very inflexible. It needs to be changed. And they come up with a more sort of community-driven definition. So this one hasn't been reviewed, but we can probably have some confidence that since it's here and this has been developed by the Poldrack Lab, it is somewhat sort of curated and it's not a terrible definition. So what if we want to do more investigation on our own? Well, we could look down here to these different citations that might just get us directly to working memory. So this is actually a very, I think this is a pretty famous paper on working memory that we could read. It's in Science, and oh, what a surprise, I'm behind a paywall. So the other thing that we might be interested in, let's say that we're in grad school and actually our advisor just sent us out. He said, go design me a study to measure working memory. And I went, oh, I don't know any tasks or I don't know how to do that. Well, guess what? Here's a way that you can start to do that, because here's an entire list of different tasks and paradigms, whether you show someone pictures in an fMRI machine or whether you have them do some sort of paper exercise. These are different tasks that are asserted to measure working memory and would be a good sort of start. And so the other reason you might be here is to understand relationships. And this is really this is the cool part about the Cognitive Atlas that I want you to understand. The Cognitive Atlas is really, it's an ontology because it's modeling a graph. And so when we talk about working memory, you can think of this as a node in the graph. And these relationships to other concepts are basically links from this node to other nodes in the graph. And there's actually different kinds of links. So we can say working memory is a kind of memory. Working memory is a part of decision making. And each of these links would have different weights associated. And it's really nice because you can just quickly be like, oh, I didn't know that working memory is a part of maintenance. Well, let's check out what that is. Maintenance, the process of keeping information active. And okay, that makes sense. But the really cool part is that now, one thing I didn't point out before is that we can click on this graph button, and it's actually teaching us a little bit because it gives us, there's this graph database called Neo4j, and it gives us this nice little command we can copy paste, and we'll go to the larger view to show you. So I won't go through the syntax here, I'll leave that for the interested student, but let's do that query. So the really cool part here is we've just queried the graph database to find this node maintenance. Here it is, I'm grabbing it, I'm squiggling it, because this is like the best part of these graphs is you can squiggle them around. And I see here the relationship, so as we saw, object maintenance is a kind of maintenance, maintenance is part of working memory, and what this offers us, so to be realistic, or to be totally honest with you, I think a lot of these graphs aren't very useful, but for visualizing a little more complex relationships that you really are having trouble kind of putting together, because these are all different things. This is an assertion, the green is concepts, these are contrasts. You can see the different things up here, and here's a task.
it can be helpful to see a visualization if it helps you to better understand things. But it's not for everyone. It's okay if you look at this and it just looks like squiggles and you just want to squiggle it around. That's okay too. It's just another tool that's meant for your learning. Very easily I can look up tasks, so I can, again, there'd be a very similar page to understand a task. A little bit different information is presented. That one's a little bit empty. There's phenotypes, so phenotypes could be something like a kind of disorder. Collections are basically just groupings of tasks. And so if you're a first-year grad student and you want to understand about different concepts and tasks and phenotypes and collections in cognitive psychology, this is a really good resource for you. Just keep this open on your computer. Now, if you're sort of more of, let's say you're ready to do an analysis, and we're actually going to talk about this next in a notebook. You actually might want to interact with this API. Now, what is an API? An API is an application programming interface. That's why it's called API. And so it's going to present you with an endpoint that you can sort of query using Python, using R, which are both languages for scientific programming, to give you JSON, which is JavaScript object notation, basically a data structure that has all this cool information that a computer can easily understand. So for example, it's very easy for me as a human to look up one concept using the actual interface. But if I'm a human that wants to look up like 100 concepts and get 100 definitions, that's going to be really hard. Okay, so here we are in my terminal, and for some of you this might look kind of scary because you've never seen this sort of thing before, but learning some basic commands like ls, where am I, present working directory. I won't go into the full like Linux tutorial, but basically using Python and generally it's a package manager called pip, and then interacting with different libraries is something that, you know, even if you don't understand it, I want you to see it because it's really, really important. And so what I'll show you quickly is that there's actually a package for the Cognitive Atlas API that we're going to use. And so I'm doing this on my local machine, but there's many different ways that you could interact with this, such as in an IPython or a Jupyter notebook, in a container. We're just going to do it locally so that it's pretty easy. And so if I do pip install Cognitive Atlas like this, what that tells me is that the module is already installed. And some people might like running a Jupyter notebook, so they would type Jupyter notebook and it would open up in their browser and be really interactive. I prefer kind of hardcore, like using the actual terminal, so I might have a preference for IPython, which is this interactive Python. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do today is figure out how we can go from a brain map. So let's go to actually a different term, something that I was really interested in when I was a grad student, anxiety. Let's see, let's look up the concept anxiety. Here we go. So anxiety, an aversive psychophysiological state characterized by fear, worry, or concern associated with a current or impending threat, often elicited by general and specific interoceptive or exteroceptive cues. That sounds a lot like grad school. Anyway, so here's the cool part. I would be reading about this in the literature. I would come here, I'd find my definition, I'd find tasks, but I'd still have this question about like, what is going on in the brain during an experience of anxiety? And I could look at the graph, you know, I could look at the JSON from the API. It's not super helpful because I don't really know the kinds of questions I want to ask yet. But look at this, there's this little button here that says search on Neurosynth. What's Neurosynth? So I'm taken to this interface where all of a sudden I see a brain map. And actually what we're seeing here is bilateral amygdala activation, which, if you read the literature, is sort of your fear center and what you would expect to see in some sort of study, and you definitely expect to see this in some kind of meta-analysis. I can turn on pan and zoom. I can basically show different layers. So if I really wanted, I could hide the anatomical. If you remember in the beginning, we talked about how there's different kinds of brain scans. This gray thing in the back that obviously looks like a brain is an anatomical image, so it's like the snapshot, and we use it so we can say, aha, this is, we know that's where the amygdala is, and obviously if we if we take it away, it just looks like blobs in space. But these blobs in space are statistical brain maps that are derived from the functional data, which, as you remember, is over time. And so the z-score is sort of the normalized score for the strength of the activation. These XYZ are voxel coordinates, so it's like the location where you are in the brain. And the cool thing about Neurosynth is then you can look up, remember how before we were trying to like find individual studies? This map is derived from coordinates that are from all of these studies. And look at this, there's 45 pages of them. And how does this actually work? I won't go into the details, but what Neurosynth basically does, well, let's take a look at this one of these studies, is it takes a look at the abstract. So I wonder if we can get quickly to this study. So it takes a look at an abstract, and it looks for this term anxiety. And as you can see, I've just highlighted, there are a crap ton of anxieties in this abstract. And so what it does is it finds papers that have sort of an over representation as compared to sort of the background noise of the term, and it says, okay, well, we're going to kind of guess that this paper has something to do with anxiety. And so then it puts it into a meta-analysis technique that takes into account where these voxels are located. And then it basically then looks for, it puts all these studies together, so all these voxels from the different studies, it does things like account for the number of subjects in the study, and it finds the areas of the brain map where there's sort of a significant overlap. And I won't go into the details of this method, but it's a really simple method, and it's a very good way, and I think even the author or the creator of the software was surprised how well it seemed to work to come up with these very good brain maps. Good in the sense they show what you would expect from a real and actual meta-analysis. And so if you want to learn more about this, come and read the FAQs here. This is where it's going to get into nitty-gritty details for stuff that you'll learn about later, like correction for multiple comparisons. And if you really are interested, you can actually go to the GitHub repository, and I'll again leave this as an exercise for you, and download the Neurosynth API, or it's a little Python package that you're going to install with pip, and akin to the one that we looked at for the Cognitive Atlas, it's going to walk you through doing your own meta-analysis, asking your own questions, and saving your own brain maps. And in fact, I'll point out that there's this tutorial here. Here's an example of a Jupyter notebook. And so Neurosynth is cool. This is the coolest feature. It's actually being sort of deprecated. There's a new library coming out called Nightmare. But this is one of the drivers that I discovered in, I think maybe 2011, that I really fell in love with as just software in a database, and it took me into this field to begin with. So definitely check out this website. You can look up locations. There's a new feature that was added that makes sort of associations with genes from the Allen Brain Atlas. One thing that's really actually kind of cool is called the decoder. And so quickly I'll show you another tool that's provided by the Puldrak Lab. It's called NeuroVault. NeuroVault is a really good place where you can go to find brain maps. And so these aren't any kind of brain maps. These are statistical brain maps that are sort of the result of putting many images together to come up with sort of a final brain map that has some kind of z-score that represents the result of a study. So for example, ICA is independent component analysis. That's going to be looking at different independent components in the brain. And so the cool part is that you can, for example, select a brain map. And under this analysis, so this is a very similar viewer. It's cool in that you can kind of click around. This one's a bit bigger. very upset because we've missed some metadata. But if you go to analysis, there's some really cool stuff you can do. You can click this button to do decoding, which is going to do the same kind of analysis with this map. So this is a little bit, needs some thresholding here. The idea is that you can generate your own brain maps and then do decoding. This is really the view that you'd want. You'd want to know, based on this map that I found, what terms in this database are sort of most strongly correlated. And again, it's a correlation. You can kind of take that as you will, but this one, the strongest value is, or the strongest correlation is temporal. And so if we go back and look at the map that wasn't totally crazy, that kind of makes sense. The temporal, here we go. The other thing that's cool you can do in NeuroVault is you can search the database for similar maps. So this is like the Find Brain Maps Like Mine tool. And I'll show this off because when I was a grad student, this was one of my first contributions to Poldrack Lab, and it's still there, so it minimally isn't that quite terrible. The other thing you can do, you can download the maps, you can do gene expression decoding, which is that same data, I believe, from the Allen Brain Atlas. This one takes a little bit longer because it's a little more bit of a load on the server. But then you can get all these interesting genes to look up if you're interested in association between genes and brain. And the other thing you can do is there's there was a great, I think she was a postdoc named Joke in the lab, who made these neuropower tools. So if you're more on the statistics side of things and you want to look at things like power, there's this beautiful toolbox called Neuropower Tools. So I've just shown you a lot. There are quite a few awesome tools provided by the Poldrack Lab. And if you don't remember where all these things are, you should come to the poldracklab.stanford.edu. Here you can find just basic high-level links to the Poldrack Lab on GitHub. But under the main homepage, you find links to all of these tools. And I didn't even go over Open Neuro, which is this new data sharing platform where you can find a lot of data. All we went over today is the Cognitive Atlas. We didn't go over OpenFMRI, which is the equivalent of NeuroVault, but for the raw functional data. We went over NeuroVault, we went over Neurosynth. And by the way, if you're starting to get into analysis, you might want to look at the brain imaging data structure. It's a standard for literally how you organize your files on your computer, because guess what? If you do it in an organized way, it's going to be really easy to plug into existing tools. And if you don't, it's going to be really hard. So with that, my Padawans, you are empowered to move on to do good brain imaging research. And we'll leave it at that.
Dinosaur.